Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Caroline McCusick. I'm an associate editor for the humanities at Stanford University Press, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of SUP to our book event today. Today, we'll be discussing Jordan Carroll's Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors and the Class Politics of US Literature, and Michael Dango's Crisis Style, The Aesthetics of Repair, in conversation. The authors will start us out by thinking together about how their projects speak to each other. We'll then follow with a discussion from Margaret Ronda, Leigh Claire La Berge, and Anna Kornblue, and questions from Post 45 collective members and series editors, Kate Marshall and Loren Glass. Finally, we'll open it up to discussion. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function so that I can ask them during the discussion portion. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Loren Glass to get us started.
Thank you, Carolyn, and welcome to all of you participants, visible and invisible. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the series and then hand it off to Kate. I was not present at the inception of this collective, but legend has it that it originated in a rejected MSA panel, which is appropriate in a number of ways that we might talk about. This was in 2006, and this was a group of younger scholars who saw themselves as emergent junior scholars in a new field, many of whom are now, I think, established senior scholars in an established field, which they have been partly responsible for establishing. And indeed, the press was started in 2012. The original editors were Michael Zele and Florence Dorr, the original editor at Stanford, Emily Jane Cohen. And I think we have the rare privilege of looking back here on our 10th anniversary and seeing a series that has really participated in shaping a field, both in terms of periodization and methodology. And I just wanted to quickly say a few things that, for me, looking back retrospectively, I think the series has participated in changing or developing in the larger field of literary studies. One very notable thing is the decline or even the eclipse of the term postmodernism as a periodizing term. And I think that's a striking development that our series has participated in. Also, the shift from a focus on individual artists to institutions. I would say that on the whole, Post 45 is our institutional studies, both in terms of topic and method. And then also a shift from literature to media, which I think we're seeing really across English studies, but that I think that our series has illustrated and affected quite effectively. And then I just, as a sort of thought experiment that I shared with the group before we went on here, I'm wondering whether now in 2022, the period designated by the end of World War II can be deemed over. In other words, we're now looking back at a historical epic as opposed to intervening in a contemporary moment. So those are my thoughts to share. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I will hand it over to my co-editor, Kate Marshall.
Thanks, everyone. And I will follow Loren by congratulating Michael and Jordan on their remarkable books, thanking today's panelists. I'd also like to direct you to a few highlights from just the past couple of years in the Post 45 series to read alongside Crisis Style and Reading the Obscene. These include Sarah Bruyette's outstanding 2019 case study of one of the most important global institutions of cultural policy formation, UNESCO, and the fate of the literary. Then from 2020, we have A Violent Peace, Race, US Militarism and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific by Christine Hong, which provides an examination of US militarism's centrality to the Cold War cultural imagination that she explores through a Trans-Pacific archive. Also in 2020, we have Dorothy Hale's The Novel and the New Ethics, which accounts for the new will to believe in the ethical value of literature and the deeply thorough devotion to an ethics of otherness that characterizes so much of contemporary writing. And in addition to our subjects for today, 2021 also saw the publication of Mary Estev's Incremental Realism, Post-War American Fiction, Happiness and Welfare State Liberalism, which is a revisionist literary and cultural history of efforts undertaken by literary realists, public intellectuals, and policy activists to advance the value of public institutions and the claims of socio and economic economic justice at mid-century. And hot off the presses this year, we have The Strange Career of Racial Liberalism by Joseph Darda, an account of the rise of liberal anti-racism and its internal resistances that undercut future redistributive movements. We're also anticipating the June publication this year of Palmer Rampell's study of how genre fiction redefined the category of the private person in genres of privacy in post-war America. So keep an eye out. And with that, I will hand it back over to Michael and Jordan to tell us a bit more about their books.
I'd like to start off by thanking Michael for proposing the idea of a joint book launch. I'd also like to thank all of our moderators and respondents, as well as Stanford University Press for hosting this event. I was especially drawn to Post 45 because I've long admired authors in the series, and I hope that my book builds upon their research in some small way. My Post 45 influences include, but are not limited to, Lauren Glass, Sarah Briette, Jared Gardner, Michael Zale, Stephen Schreier, Jasper Burns, and Andy McClanahan. These are just some of the amazing Post 45 authors that I happened to be reading while working on the book. I have since come to know and love entries in the series, including books by Margaret and Michael as well. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Post 45 Journal, which I think is one of the best places to publish timely and accessible criticism today. My own Post 45 book examines how editors in the 20th century marketed borderline obscene literature to audiences comprised mainly of affluent white men in the professional managerial class. I look at case studies including H.L. Mencken at the Smart Set and American Mercury, Bill Gaines and Al Feldstein at EC Comics, Hugh Hefner at Playboy Magazine, Lawrence Ferlinghetti at City Lights Books, and Barney Rossett at Grove Press. Through these examples, I show that reading obscene literature proved crucial to the formation of middle-class masculinity in the United States during the mid-century period. This was an era of Fordist factories and bureaucratic firms that structured themselves to match the cold impersonality of capitalist abstraction. To succeed in these organizations, then, members of the professional managerial class were forced to adopt an emotionally distant perspective that allowed them to see others as interchangeable components in a larger system. Where does the obscene fit into all of this? One of the key prongs in the test for obscenity in American law is whether the publication elicits an erotic or shameful response from its intended audience. Even erotica could potentially become chaste if its likely reader approached the book from the detached reserve of a disinterested professional. Because editors were often the defendants in these trials, running the risk of imprisonment, they took great pains to reframe obscene or borderline obscene publications so that they appealed to imagined audiences, including doctors, lawyers, anthropologists, and other members of the professional managerial class. These upstanding citizens supposedly possessed the self-control to read about eroticism without feeling a salacious or morbid interest in sex. Aestheticizing or intellectualizing the obscene became an opportunity for members of this class to show that they could resist unwanted emotions and deny forbidden sensations, transcending their bodies to become good middle-class subjects. In short, encounters with obscenity provided a sentimental education for middle managers in gray flannel suits. At the same time, these button-down professionals obviously derived great pleasure from racy stories and nude pictorials. But when they really allowed their erotic imaginations to run rampant, they still fantasized about a sexuality neutralized by scientific management. Hefner's Playboys, for example, indulged in science fictional scenarios in which they ran their love lives like a business enterprise with the assistance of an advanced mainframe computer whose algorithms helped them maximize the number of assignations they could keep, all while maintaining a busy work schedule. Swinging bachelors dreamed about the real subsumption of reproductive labor. As this last example suggests, there's an obviously gendered dimension at play here. What Gay Talese calls sensual engineering allowed mid-century men to fortify and consolidate their heterosexual masculinity by denying excessive feelings that were always coded as feminine. Censors were often depicted as pearl-clutching school marms or closet homosexuals, while the women in these pornographic narratives typically end up as both sex objects and secretaries. literary transgression left both class and gender hierarchies intact, even as it allowed for a more flexible and expansive definition of middle-class manhood. Now that I've laid out my project, I'd like to speak for a second about the ways that I think that it dovetails with Michael's book. Although at first these may seem like two very different monographs, I think we're grappling with some of the same questions or problems. We're both analyzing what might be called mediating terms, institutions or formations that reside somewhere between the immense structures of critical theory on one hand and the textual particularities of close reading on the other. We're also both very much interested in what Foucault would call the aesthetics of existence, artistic styles that are also ways of being in the world. Finally, I think that we're both seeking to break up and remix how scholars group together texts or artworks. Each chapter of my book analyzes a set of texts based on their editor or publisher, while Michael's book organizes them by style. Indeed, through his concept of the promiscuous archive, Michael's work clarifies and embodies what has long drawn me to the Post-45 series, its willingness to cross boundaries that have often siloed off fields and disciplines from one another. Michael's encyclopedic study demonstrates an incredible range, even as it shows a remarkable sensitivity to nuance and complexity. And I think it will offer a great inspiration to future scholars working on post-war literature and culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, for talking so much about your book and its connections with mine. I'm looking forward to exploring some of those as well. But I also want to begin just by thanking Loren and Kate for really great editorial work and making me feel at home in this series at a time, obviously, in a sort of early career where that has been very anxiety producing to try to publish. And so thank you so much for your guidance through this, as well as to the team at Stanford, especially Faith and Erica, who saw me through the book process. And I'm really excited too to be in conversation today with you three, Margaret, Anna, and Leigh Claire. I've always admired all of your work, each of your works. And so it's really exciting to be here with you all today. So I'll also talk a little bit about my book and how I think it maybe fits into a larger post-45 project that Jordan and I are both joining. My book had kind of two main ambitions, each kind of referenced in the title. On the one hand, it's a book about crisis. It's trying to theorize what it means when crisis has become what Eric Kasdan calls chronic or Lauren Berlant calls ordinary, when crisis is less a decisive once-in-a-lifetime event and more like a mood. So when labor becomes decommodified, as La Berge might say, and when we do not have control over the conditions of both our productive and reproductive lives, how do people keep going, regaining at least a fantasy of control? And when neoliberalism individualizes everything, but individuals, of course, cannot fix climate change or political polarization or wage stagnation or the defunding of public goods, how do they act in ways as if they're repairing those big problems? So on this front, I was particularly interested in what Melanie Klein, so often blamed for the reparative turn in cultural studies and literary criticism, though definitively corrected, I think, recently by Patricia Stuka's Ruse of Repair. I was interested in what Klein called manic repair and obsessive repair. Two ways of feeling like you repair a problem, but you really don't. So in manic repair, you just kind of pretend the problem isn't a problem after all. In obsessive repair, you pick something smaller to fix to kind of get a sense of control, even when the big problem persists. So it's like, cleaning your apartment instead of writing the essay whose deadline has passed. But I wanted to say we do that with much bigger or more structural problems too. So some of us invest in Marie Kondo's life-changing magic of tidying up, instead of in transforming the conditions that made it so life needed to be changed in the first place, such as economic precarity or planetary death. So it's a book about surviving crisis, but the other key word, of course, is style. And it's a book about aesthetic style in particular. And my intuition was that aesthetic style might absorb reparative strategies people have improvised and begun to hold in common. That is, it's in style more than representation, for instance, that we could analyze some strategies of repair that people have adopted. Style picks up on often unconscious ways of adjusting to the world. So, sometimes you get up in the morning and you put on an outfit, and it's only later you realize that that outfit is your power outfit, your suit of armor to the world. And maybe you really needed that sense of confidence as a buffer between you and the occupational stresses you were going to be encountering that day. In a similar way, I think novels put on a particular style of sentence, or films put on a particular kind of camera movement to repair things in the world that are stressing them out. In the book, I name and theorize 4 styles, which I call detox, binge, filter, and ghost. Each collects what I call a promiscuous archive across media and genre. So a big set of objects under the name of a common category of repair, just like a promiscuous person might have a lot of partners, but also say they have a type. In doing so, I also hope to revise some common art and literary historical genealogies of cultural production in the past 50 years or so. So for instance, what's the best way to distinguish Ernest Hemingway and Raymond Carver? They both pare down their sentences, but what Hemingway usually has left is an abundance of natural environments. So he's conserving nature, whereas the environment is exactly what Carver tries to get rid of from his sentences in the period of the Great Acceleration that Margaret Ronda has so eloquently explored by way of poetic form. So Carver's prose detoxes the environment in a period when it starts to seem threatening. So the way I think that this book is kind of contributing to post-45 studies is it's joining 2 main types of projects. First, it's doubling down on formalism as what Anna Kornblue calls the central proficiency of literary critics, and form as the best way to study affect in particular, like in Eugenie Brinkema's work, although I'm interested in thinking of style as a bit distinct from form. So I theorize style as what I call a coordination of form and content. Second, it's trying to join taxonomical projects like Caroline Levine's Forms, Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, or Cien Nai's Our Aesthetic Categories, Zany, Cute, Interesting, where the subtitles give us a list of categories of cultural production. And I think that as algorithms and consumer logics do a lot of the work of categorizing aesthetic and social fields for us, so Amazon or Netflix says if we like X, we'll also like Y, we in cultural criticism should be doing some countermapping, laying out a field of categories that is not already common sense in order to make counterintuitive, promiscuous archives that recommend unexpected affiliations. As Jordan said, I think that that's one of the connections between our work, is thinking about kind of categories that maybe don't reduce to things like the author or even necessarily particular social networks, something that might be more institutional or shared across collective spaces that can't be neatly kind of predicted in advance by a Bourdieuian type mapping of the social world. I think that another thing that I really learned from Jordan's book is how sort of larger crises, like I explore in my book, register at a kind of emotional or affective level as something like a crisis in masculinity, which is something that Jordan really expertly explores through his editors. So how do people kind of navigate things like gender and class performance in everyday life that is also in a way trying to repair, at least in a personal sense, these kind of larger structural problems. So I'm really excited to think about how our books, which are so different in archive, also share some larger theoretical concerns in thinking about the status of institutions, the role of intermediary functions, like Jordan also said, in terms of the editor or other institutional forms that come in between big structures and grand narratives and the individual author or reader. So thank you again all for being here today.
I think I'm up next, and I want to just say how delighted I am to be here to celebrate these 2 dynamic and important new books, which are such terrific contributions to the post-45 conversation that Kate, Loren, and the folks at Stanford have been curating over the past several years. It's been a real pleasure to read these 2 books together, as their combination really throws into relief the significant innovation of their approaches. So I'm going to kind of talk about them in concert and think about how they sort of produce a collaborative or collective sensibility. Interested in their kind of collective or shared approaches to the study of everyday aesthetic practices and the uses of literature in the present. They draw on and retool elements of sociological and institutional criticism, affect theory, queer theory, historicism, and formalist reading to develop analyses of textual action and a shared critical style that we might characterize as ambivalent in disposition and promiscuous in archival selection. These studies offer incisive and deft accounts of the social styles, obscene, manic, obsessive, intimate, of late capitalism, and the antagonisms of class, gender, race, and sexuality that such styles lay bare. Carroll's reading The Obscene elaborates a compelling genealogy of the corporate style of post-war obscene literature through a richly detailed portrait of the cultural field of editors, publishers, content moderators, legal discourses, and capitalist management techniques that underwrite the reading strategies this body of literature produced. Dango's crisis style generates a remarkable taxonomy of the key styles of neoliberalism: detox, filter, binge, and ghost, threading together a wide array of cultural objects from literary works to film, fashion to architecture, digital forms to activist practices. Dango's book foregrounds the actions these styles stage and the fantasies of repair they enact. The analytical approaches of these texts depart from still dominant disciplinary reading practices that emphasize what Catherine Hales calls deep attention to the representational content of cultural forms, or that explore what Carroll terms an ethics of cultural consumption. Or as Dango writes, one consequence of the recent method wars in our profession has been to pose interpretation in essentially ethical and therefore essentially binary terms, good or bad reading. These studies turn instead to a sustained examination of what cultural forms in fact do, their actions, the practices and habits they inculcate, the effects they bring about within reading communities and larger social structures. Dango calls this method a cultural criticism without content. And it's a criticism that features, in both cases, sustained attention to certain patterns of repetition and abstraction rather than formal singularity encoded across a variety of texts, and to the actions they generate in their audience rather than forms of psychological interiority or emotional depth. Their readings underscore what people are doing regardless of what they may say they are feeling or thinking, as Dango puts it. Refusing the binaries of good and bad reading, these studies reflect skepticism of interpretive modes that highlight the subversive or resistant work of the cultural text, that read either redemptively or suspiciously. Profoundly interested in the social circulation of forms of intimacy, eros, and affect, Carroll and Dango's books highlight the multiple, complex, contrary directions and ends of such forms. These studies accordingly operate at a certain distance from their objects of analysis, modeling an ambivalent mode of aesthetic judgment, or what Carroll terms impersonal readings. This dispassionate, or what we might think of as a pragmatist evaluative mode that these critics share, is in turn reflective of the deeply equivocal social character of the texts they engage. We can see this, for example, in Carroll's attention to the way transgressive material is tooled to bureaucratic capitalist ends, cultivating responses in its white, professional, managerial, masculine readers, such as masochism, passivity, detachment, and cynicism. Or in his discussion of contemporary alt-right trolls and incels as inheritors of these earlier management techniques of obscene literature. Or in Dango's work, the reparative action of texts as a fantasy of social resolution is as often actively harmful as it is therapeutic, as in the racialized logics of exclusion that emerge in styles such as detox and filter. The critical methods and concepts these projects mobilize thus illuminate key social contradictions in post-war and contemporary social experience: the abject hegemony of white corporate masculinity, the desire for intimacy, mastery, and control in the face of capitalist restructurings of the spheres of work and non-work, the forms of antisocial sociality that emerge in relation to capitalist crisis and neoliberal institutional decline. Contradictions all that arise as expressions of the relentless expansion in this period of the productive logics and imperatives of capitalism into all arenas of social life. The readings across these two books reveal how textual styles and actions stage and even deepen rather than resolve these contradictions and antagonisms. Their ambivalent analyses deftly highlight these ongoing impasses, revealing forms of neoliberal crisis that remain beyond repair, or delineating new restrictions on erotic expression in the post-pornographic digital era. At the same time, these works reveal powerful appraisals of the improvisatory, ever-changing ways that such socially circulated strategies allow their readers to adapt to, move within, navigate the social forms of laboring, domestic, and erotic life within the crisis every day of post-war capitalism. In so doing, they offer compelling critical models for mapping this emergent and fluid cultural field. So when I say congratulations to both of you for these truly impressive and groundbreaking works, and I'm looking forward to talking with you more about them today.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm so glad to be here. It's a German evening and a Pacific morning, I guess. And I too want to start by congratulating Jordan and Michael on their books, but also Kate and Loren on their series, which I know has been so important to so many of us. It's always interesting to see literary history in the present, and that's exactly what I thought last week when CNN's lead story on Russia-Ukraine offered the headline, quote, "Putin's use of crude language reveals a lot about his worldview," end quote. In true psychoanalytic fashion, the article could not explicitly delineate Putin's various obscenities. Rather, it offered hints and associations that any reader of the History of Sexuality, Volume 1 would appreciate. So Jordan, your book has been with me a lot during this. So the two books for discussion this evening, Reading the Obscene and Crisis Style, not only complement the Post-45 series, but they complement each other. And I think each reveals important considerations about the present and future of American literary studies and its relationship to both formalism and historicism. I'm going to frame my remarks tonight around a term that emerges towards the end of Jordan's book, Reading the Obscene, and that term is monopoly capital. As I was reading Jordan's book, whose observations I think offer one of the more creative literary histories I've read in some time, I became more and more convinced that I was reading a cultural history of this somewhat neglected political economic term, one which has been supplanted in recent years by discussions of finance capital and financialization, and also, of course, neoliberalization. But monopoly capital was also a term whose cultural logic was not, as Stuart Hall once quipped, a revolt in the superstructure by the superstructure. Rather, its cultural logic was managerial, and it radiated both up and down the socioeconomic ladder. For me, Grove Press is the linchpin here, and Harry Braverman, whose magisterial study, Labor and Monopoly Capital, the Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, was an editor at Grove Press. His career as avant-garde editor and political economist is an example of something, but what precisely? I think this is a sort of ground we should think about trying to delineate. In many ways, Braverman's title sets the scene for Jordan's book by asking, what is the relationship between mid-century transformation of capitalism and the social codes that those so transformed experienced as either degrading or as a refusal of degradation? How do these subjects begin to manage their own degradation and that of others? I think there's a sort of refrain about this kind of labor degradation that runs through this book. Those exposed to obscenities may be degraded, thus social caution is the letter of the day. But then somehow out of these various cascading scenes of economic and social degradation, a professional middle class emerges to suspend the contradiction in aesthetic judgment, no less than in the changing imperatives of publishing, before it too becomes a vertical monopoly industry. So the obscene here creates a common ground for embodiment, for the concretization of abstract tendencies of capital, and the body, the text, and the labor process all sort of start to inhabit this obscene habitus that I think Jordan really does a wonderful job of laying out. One thing I was thinking that we could talk about is I do think that this book offers a rather different take on abstraction and its relationship to consciousness and embodiment. And I'd also be so curious to think about the work that this book could do in conversation with something like Kevin Floyd's Queer Marxism, the reification of desire. And I'd like to think about what kind of sort of genealogical work a book like this could do towards the development of a queer Marxism through its literary and business history. Michael's capacious crisis style excavates some of the same historical moments, but with a different promiscuous archive. And I think these two books form a kind of sequence, particularly in methodology and periodization. Certainly some of the characters and crisis style, Richard Serra come to mind, can be read as a kind of future extension of the professional middle class into an age of early financialization. I think one of the real opportunities offered by putting crisis style into conversation with reading the obscene is one of methodology. It seems to be an almost obsessive interest of Michael, and I appreciate that so deeply. So I was particularly drawn to his book's introduction into what he calls the taxonomy of style that he's gonna work through in the monograph. While C.N. Nye's our aesthetic categories offered a categorical palette of adjectives, cute, zany, interesting, Michael offers us categories which have both noun and verb forms: detox, binge, filter, ghost. And the verb now redundancy exemplifies, of course, one of the central arguments of the book, namely that style must necessarily be enacted and therefore is itself an action. Just as the sheer expansiveness of Michael's archive enacts the kind of taxonomizing practices he says we now require to make our way through 20th and 21st century cultural production. In our own present, what, Michael asks, are the theoretical possibilities for theorizing this concept of style that takes into account our longue durée of crisis? And here Michael returns to the scene of the macro and micro, as he calls them, of Marx and Foucault. But as he does so, he excavates a new site for production and contest, namely those styles which emerge in this moment, redound to it not only as problems of judgment, but as derivatives of a regime of racial capital. Thus, Michael says that the styles in his book all shares what he calls, quote, an aspiration to whiteness, end quote. And here again, I was hoping we could talk about the genealogical work that this book is doing and calling on us to do, because Michael's book displays such a wonderful talent for mixing and combining archives, for metabolizing and synthesizing critical traditions and their idioms. But I do have one sort of bibliographic question about the conceptualization of crisis. Michael points out that crisis in both the Marxist and Foucauldian traditions neglect the problem of the reproduction of whiteness at the level of critique. And I absolutely agree with this point, and I think there's more to talk about here. Yep, I kept wondering, as I was reading his work, where the role of scholars such as Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore and Jordan Camp are, who precisely say that the crisis of our present is a crisis of racial capital since the post-Bretton Woods moment. And I'd love for us to put this book, and Jordan's book too, into the conversation with this history of Black Marxism, because I think in many ways, Michael, the taxonomy you lay out, and I'm particularly thinking about your transmutation of surplus capital, surplus labor, into the problem of binge and detox, dovetail with this work in Black Marxism so powerfully. At the same time, your book indicates such a range of thought and categories that I know that you've considered this work. And so I'm just so interested to hear why it didn't seem ultimately, there ultimately wasn't a place for it, if I'm reading that correctly, in the genealogy that you lay out, which is, again, just to conclude my remarks, so absolutely impressive. As I was reading your book, I kept waiting for a new archive, a new style, a new introduction, and it sort of invariably came. And so it also was a pleasure to read, a sort of aesthetic pleasure in in the Kantian sense. So again, congratulations to you both, and I'm really excited to talk to everyone further.
Hi, it's just a total delight to read these genius fruits of your labor, even though we're still in the black squares, and one can't wait for a party to celebrate these wonderful books and the 10th anniversary of this series. So thanks for being here. These are just incredibly voracious projects with so much to dig into, and I will be both repeating and sort of failing to attain the level of our two previous commentators, but I look forward to the conversation. So although these books both span like quite a length of time, from the mid 20th century to like yesterday, right? Together they theorize the work of culture across that span. And they do that theorizing with the help of a conception of aesthetic experience as profoundly central to the management of economic contradictions. But it's a conception that varies from the usual, I think, for both of you. The regular flavor is something like there's a cerebralization of social misery into practical answers, right? So if you don't know what to do about class struggle, you're supposed to marry up. Or if you realize that race is the modality in which classes lived, then like a novel's here to help you ontologize the other and like, you know, tamp down that realization, right? So usual methods, I think, understand aesthetic ideology as the consolation of integration. We find a narrative to suture antagonism. We fix an image to dispel impossibility. But both of these books really do set aside this quite familiar, although I think still illuminating, formulation. And I think you both are tracing instead aesthetic experience as far less cerebral and far more, I think, corporeal, really. That there is a kind of account of consuming art as endurance training for tolerating how weird things are in both of these books. And so then aesthetic experience is offering not a cognitive solution to contradiction, especially the crises of productivity after the post-war boom with its attendant privatizations and subsumptions and surplus populations. But, you know, so not a cognitive solution, but instead an affective calisthenics towards it. And there's a quality of the provisional in this training. So rather than schooling our fantasies, art is like torquing our energy in a certain direction for a little while. And so like all exercise, repetition becomes crucial, right? You have to keep doing it. Reading the Obscene gives us the stylized and serial consumption of sex and violence as habituation, right? For detached but charismatic managerialism. And crisis style gives us style itself as ongoingness, as this just busyness of living, the practical knowledge of resilience that makes the crisis, if not manageable, at least habitable, to quote Dango. So in both arguments, there's this repetitive tuning of the senses that builds muscle memory for getting through the day, when work makes little sense, when class status is shifting, when institutions are in disarray, and power never quits. So art is the like vehicle of habit here. And I think this is a reconceptualization of aesthetic experience that broadly resonates various post-critical modes. And you know, it's possible that I'm kind of having the hangover of being the 19th century person in the room when I'm going to pose this question, but I do think that it's that in both books it speaks to the kind of convergence of art with the business of the everyday, aesthetic experience not as reprieve from ordinary cogs, but as grease for the gears. Not as the alternative to the workday, but its hyperextension. And one wonders how to situate this shift. Does it pertain to a period in cultural history, as perhaps Adorno or Jameson about two different times would suggest, right? Or does it rather pertain to a kind of shift in our own prisms for cultural study? The other thing that comes to the fore for me from the juxtaposition of these books is the elective or maybe idiosyncratic way that the emphasis on the aesthetic education of desire draws from and doesn't draw from psychoanalysis in both books. there's a kind of definite exchange. There's a flow of affects, which is anchoring both arguments, I think. The editorial cool of Mencken's productive estrangement, as Carroll calls it, from the masses, that cool checks smut across his publications and tutors the composure of PMC consumers. Or in a similar flow, the mania of Miyake's long thread in continuously spun, untailored cloth swaddles the shopper undifferentiatedly, preparing the body for neoliberal flexible accumulation. So there's this way that there are these seamless transmissions that unite artist and spectator, editor and reader, designer and consumer. And it, I think, conjures in both books for me a kind of miasma of culture in which affects sync with forms, and where, as I, above, like art is experience, and the two are totally continuous. But it's this fluidity, though, that I think seems to indicate that you guys are pouring from a spigot other to psychoanalysis, with its chasms of failed transmissions and unmasterable responses and contradictions between what is represented and what resists. So kind of whither the unconscious, right? The detours of aesthetic mediation, the compulsions and adhesions that don't materialize as affect, pleasure unruled and unreparative. Ambivalence, as I think Margaret so nicely pointed out, right, is common to you both. And that's, after all, a strategy not for managing contradiction, but for repressing it, right? For stamping it out. So it's possible that these two questions about how to think culture and its discontents are actually only one question. It's also possible that I remain pandemically deranged and with the war on the TV and so on. But that question would be like, if aesthetic experience has become endurance training, and so the kind of enigma of the aesthetic object is receding from our critical eye, if our study is of miasmic phenomenality without opacity, are we in a critical period of preparing ourselves for a world after interpretation in the ruins of our intellectual institutions, or at least a world after art?
Thank you all so much. That was really amazing. If we don't have any questions in the Q&A, attendees, please feel free to write questions in the Q&A and I'll bring them up. But I think Margaret, Leigh Claire, and Anna all raised a lot of really juicy questions that Jordan and Michael, I wonder if you want to get into any of them in particular.
Sure. Well, thank you for these responses, which I think, first of all, articulate the book better than I could. So thank you for being so generous in your kind of accounts of what we're doing in our books. I mean, I am curious about the kind of periodization questions that seem to kind of emerge across all three of these, and which Loren was also kind of beginning us with, like, are we kind of moving out of a period? This is something that I struggled with in the book, because like one of the archives, which is kind of minimalism, it has a kind of 60-year history, but some of my archives are much more compressed. And I think that it's difficult when we're also trying to kind of locate the larger structural pieces that seem consistent across time, particularly when we're thinking about economic structures. When does the sort of financialization kind of period start, et cetera, et cetera. And on the one hand, this is where I particularly felt kind of anxiety in being a member of this series, because I always worry about my work being kind of historicist enough, and that's such a kind of driving force of the post-45 kind of collective. But I think that one of the ways in which I was trying to think through with crisis style, in terms of thinking about kind of mood as a way of periodizing, was thinking about how this kind of mood of crisis kind of carries through multiple kind of mini periods that we could perhaps locate of neoliberalization or late capitalism's, many flavors or varieties, or the sort of transmission or transgression of different political regimes. So this is where the kind of affect theory was useful for me, was what happens when we kind of periodize at the level of mood and what people are doing in response to that, as opposed to the sort of grand narratives of particular economic events, or even Bretton Woods or 1973 and the gold standard or anything like that. But that also suggests, I think, too, my kind of ambivalence towards a more psychoanalytic inflected affect theory, as Anna is pointing to, which on the one hand is just like my own kind of personal problems with psychoanalysis and ambivalent attachments to thinking at the one hand that Freud is just absolutely right about things, and then the next day kind of not. But I am trying to think more about what kind of accounts can we give of the world that are somewhat surface level, although I wouldn't call them surface reading, in terms of what people are doing rather than necessarily what their unconsciouses are kind of programming them or to do. And in that respect, I think that I was trying to kind of move even in a kind of direction that Jordan also is going with his book, in terms of thinking about how texts have a kind of agency that is acted out in the world, and that we might be interested in tracking that agency even more than kind of tracking the depth psychology that might be beneath it.
Yeah, I was interested in the question of periodization as well in this book, and it's something that kind of didn't make it into the book as much. So I started this project. I was reading a lot of like autonomous Marxism and stuff about immaterial labor and affective labor. And it seems like, and this is maybe a kind of reductive account of this, there's an argument that the capitalist workplace began sort of colonizing the private sphere on or around 1973. And as I got into this project, it seemed like a lot of the things that people say emerged in post-Fordism and emerged after post-73 are really things that people are talking about in the mid-century period, although they're not quite functioning in the same way. So part of the argument of the project that might be kind of submerged is that a lot of the things that we think about in terms of virtuosity and flexibility and a certain kind of post-Fordist work ethic emerge in the contradictions within mid-century white-collar labor, which is already very much like, I don't necessarily love the term immaterial labor or anything, but answers to many of the same descriptions that are under that rubric. So yeah, I think thinking about monopoly capital is really interesting there too as well, and thinking about the ways that a lot of that process of abstraction and reification is not something that doesn't impact the kind of intimate lives of the people involved with it. And we have to think through the ways that these structures shaped subjectivity during this period. And the question of psychoanalysis is also interesting because I'm writing an essay now I'm supposed to be writing an essay now that kind of deals with some of those questions. I haven't figured out my relationship to psychoanalysis because I often find that I'm constantly referring to psychoanalytic structures in my readings. Like fantasy comes up a lot, for example, even though at least on paper, I think I'm a Foucauldian. And so it's complicated, but I think that it's not mutually exclusive, because I think what my project is doing is describing the way that the obscene is positioned by the editor and the publisher, and what the reader actually does with that is a very different story. So there are a few moments in the book where I point to the ways that readers actually kind of resist this sort of the public face of obscenity, and perhaps are doing something different, even as editors are always trying to keep things on the surface level and to resist excess, the unconscious, and these other kinds of dimensions in their publications.
just want to ask one quick follow-up or kind of bring up one other piece of the periodization puzzle. In Jordan, in your work, you offer this other account of 1973 as the periodizing mechanism, which is around Miller versus California. And so you talk about kind of what happens to obscenity and to pornography after an era of legal censorship. And so this a new kind of post that emerges at the end of your project, a post-pornographic era, where there are new forms of restriction on speech and erotic expression, but they're coming out of these sort of more shadowy corporate mechanisms in Silicon Valley. So I wonder if you might want to just say a little bit about periodization in that regard, this sort of new or different way of framing 1973 in relationship to some of the economic questions that you've been talking about as economic social dimensions of the project.
Yeah, it's complicated because on one hand, the legal regime under Roth has not completely gone away. We're still underneath obscenity law. Like Miller, although it modifies Roth, in some ways it preserves a lot of the main legal structure. And yet at the same time, we're in this odd period in which decensorship has occurred largely through neglect. So after Miller, we do see instances where literary works are censored, but these are relatively rare cases and not something that we see in like the everyday life of literary culture. And so I think that we see at the same time, as you pointed out, emergence of other kinds of censoring bodies, particularly in the last 20 years. So we see, for example, like Amazon now gets to say what counts as obscene. We often see in things like terms of service or even in like online platforms guidelines, obscenity law has been written into these online structures. And there's still struggles around this. Amazon will frequently delist or downgrade or remove certain things as obscene in the present. But it means that the status of obscenity has shifted considerably. We no longer see obscenity as bound up with high literary culture and with a kind of self-consciously politicized project, and at least in sort of mainstream culture. Now it seems like the obscenity struggles are around popular genres and are carried out largely by authors who I think don't have the kind of symbolic capital that maybe like Burroughs or D.H. Lawrence had. And this is unfortunate, I think, because I think it means that they've been kind of left high and dry. Like these kinds of struggles around Amazon or Smashwords or other online platforms don't get the same attention as the kind of alt-right figures who are provoking clear media responses in order to basically improve their visibility in the public sphere.
Thank you. Maybe I can return to some of the questions that folks brought up in the discussion, and perhaps following on from the conversation about periodization, we could return to Leigh Claire's question about how do we conceptualize crisis as if we think of it as a crisis of racial capitalism. How do we relate your work to traditions of Black Marxism that are thinking about the post-Bretton Woods moment as a crisis of racial capitalism? Do either of you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I was really thankful for that question because racial capitalism and Black Marxism has become really central for my current book project, which is thinking about kind of a moment in the 70s where it was possible to think of the sort of problem of sexual violence as being enmeshed in problems of state violence and kind of being a part of the movement against what would now become sort of mass incarceration or a sort of abolitionist moment. And as you say, I mean, the sort of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Golden Gulags, where surplus is such an important concept, I think has also become important for me in terms of thinking about how sexual violence is sort of distributed through kind of racial capitalist logics. I think that the reason why that tradition ended up not being as important for the crisis book is perhaps just because of a kind of methodological predisposition to critique that was kind of where I was coming from, that it almost like to get a project going, there needed to be a kind of tradition I was critiquing almost more than rather I was working alongside. So I think that kind of displays some of my own kind of critical sympathies as opposed to reparative sympathies when it comes to kind of method. And so it was easier for me somehow to kind of understand this period by beginning with where certain Marxist and Foucauldian accounts weren't able to go. That somehow was more illuminating for me than some of the accounts that kind of just explain things as they really kind of more are. So I think that that's something that I've continued to grapple with in terms of my own relationship to traditions and methods, and this is why ambivalence is such a kind of key word for me. And with a few others, we're actually doing a special issue for Post 45 on what we're calling ambivalent criticism, and what it means that that has become such a kind of dominant mode for me. And I think that one reason why the sort of racial capitalist archive, Black Marxist archive, wasn't making it into the first book is because I kind of don't have an ambivalent relationship to it. I just find it kind of basically really informative, and to the extent that I felt like there needed to be a critical edge to what I was doing in the introduction. It made sense for me to start with a different archive to which I was much more ambivalent.
Yeah, I should say, oddly enough, I'm also doing a second project that's very much about racial capitalism, thinking about science fiction through the lens of racial capitalism and the emergence of white nationalism, the alt-right, in relationship to science fiction as well. But yeah, there was also a chapter at one point that at least dealt with relative surplus populations when this was in dissertation form, and thinking primarily though about like white, rural, working class, dispossessed communities like around coal mining, and the ways that in particular in extreme splatterpunk horror, which is like this horror that exaggerates its obscenity, these populations become kind of strangely like fetishized and eroticized in a lot of the 1980s horror novels, and thinking about how obscenity becomes a way for middle class readers to in some sense think about or kind of imagine dispossessed and abandoned populations like in Appalachian mining towns through these texts. But it didn't quite fit with the overall thinking mostly about kind of mid-century white collar class politics, so it ended up going to the cutting room floor.
Can I throw in a question that sort of responds to, because, you know, we've been focusing a lot on the way in which your projects are in dialogue and, you know, and overlap. But the questions that have just come up here, I think, remind me that there are also some distinct differences. And one of them does have to do with methodology and terminology. I think folks would agree with me that Jordan's is more based in an extension of the sort of Western Marxist and terminologies that are, I think, are also associated with the series to a certain degree, and that Michael's, you are more in the idea of it sort of inventing newer methodologies and taxonomies to sort of build onto or work beyond Marx and Foucault. And I wonder I mean, obviously, I guess we feel, you know, we should be moving forward, but or should we be retrenching and really digging it? You know, I mean, obviously, this is still capitalism we're dealing with, and maybe Marx has provided us with the categories and methods that we need. I just wondered whether either of you had thoughts on, you know, the sort of tradition versus innovation question that I think gets foregrounded a little bit by this discussion and the dialogue between your projects.
Go ahead.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a Marxist, so I do think that we need to keep that tradition alive. At the same time, like I do think a lot of the most interesting things have not been in the last 10 years and have not been organized around an orthodox Marxism. I feel like that there has been so much really interesting work around feminist Marxisms and queer Marxisms and thinking about racial capitalism. And so, Black Marxism. And so, yeah, I do think that it's important to maintain continuity with that tradition, but not to simply repeat what has come before. But at the same time, yeah, I think that there are definitely new methodologies that do have a lot to say. So I'm not doctrinaire in that regard.
I think it's also important to keep alive at least a Marxist vocabulary for kind of diagnosing structure and thinking about the kind of base that we're living in through. I think that I come to Marxism and psychoanalysis and Foucault by way of queer theory is kind of where I'm was raised. And so to the extent that that was, at least in some versions, was trying from the beginning to think about syntheses of some of these traditions at the same time as shifting some of the priorities, I think is where my kind of reflexes are. And that's where the ambivalence comes from towards some of these traditions is I think also queer theory's ambivalence towards some of these traditions. I do continue to think that queer of color critique is where to find some of the best places for thinking about racial capitalism and psychoanalysis and how these different traditions can speak to one another is kind of my, I guess, belief. But I also think that there's great value in having, for lack of a better word, more orthodox approaches that we can continue to learn with and alongside. So in other words, I don't think I'm polemical about the new versus tradition thing, even as much as I think that I tend to come at things from the new perspective.
Thanks for that question, Loren. That kind of brought us back neatly to some of the questions about the place of this work in relation to queer Marxism. Well, we're now at 11, so I want to thank everyone so much for participating in this conversation, and thanks everyone for coming. And to share that Reading the Obscene and Crisis Style are both available at sup.org. And you can buy them with a 20% off discount using the code that you can see on the slide on your screen. It's Dango_Carroll20-FM. It'll get you 20% off the books and free shipping for North American purchasers. So please, everybody, go get a copy of these wonderful, amazing books. Thank you so much, Kate, Marshall, Leigh Claire, Margaret, Anna, Michael, and Jordan for being here. Everyone have a good day and goodbye.